This meeting will be recorded. Okay, great. All right, welcome everybody. Thanks again to Tara and the Park Hill Library for having us. As Tara said, my name is Beth Yohe. I'm the Executive Director of the Conflict Center, which is a small nonprofit located in North Denver. And I'm super excited to have some wonderful panelists with us today. I'm gonna introduce them, and then we're gonna jump right into some questions. And each panelist will have an opportunity to answer. And then as we go along, you are welcome to send questions of your own in the chat, and we will add those to the discussion as it proceeds. I do want to mention we have 3 fabulous panelists. We originally had planned to have 4, and unfortunately one of our panelists, Vinny Cervantes, is not feeling well. So we're sending him lots of good energy to feel better, and are excited for the 3 folks that we have with us today. The first is Carrie Joy, who's a nationally acclaimed poet, educator, organizer, and the co-executive director of the Kaleidoscope Project. So please welcome Carrie. Second is Scott Esserman, who's lived in the Park Hill neighborhood for the last 18 years. He's an educational professional and advocate who currently serves as the DPS District Accountability Committee Chair, and his passion is racial justice. Welcome, Scott. And finally, Magenta Freeman is a queer, non-binary diversity consultant and community organizer who uses she, they pronouns. She is committed to helping transform the pervasive systems that negatively impact society's most marginalized members. So welcome, Magenta. All right, thanks everyone. All right, so we're gonna just jump right into the questions, as I said, and get our conversation started. Okay, as a white woman, me, the moderator, I grew up with the message that police officers were helpers and they were people I should call. Why should I have alternatives to calling the police now? Right, so why have this conversation? Why should we have alternatives to calling the police? And as you answer that question, if there's more you want to say about yourself and what brings you to this panel, that'd be awesome too. So whoever wants to start, go ahead. Magenta, you're unmuted, so I'm going to say, why don't you go first?
Okay. All right. I guess I volunteered myself. So yeah, thank you, Beth. I'm really glad to be here. I don't really have much to say about myself, but I will say that I really do understand the question, because that has been the dominant narrative as I've understood it since I was a child. However, I also grew up aware of like this constant state of tension between police and Black people in particular. I grew up in the South, and there I actually learned to be afraid and cautious around police stops when I learned to drive. And I was actually taught by a white policeman. So it was like, when you're particularly like isolated, or if it's at night, or if it's at night, I was taught to lock the doors, stay in my car, slide documents through the window, keep my hands in sight. And you know, I doubt that most white people actually have that a similar experience to that, or that kind of training around police. But because of the murder of George Floyd and different things that have happened recently, it's becoming much clearer in a more widespread manner that, you know, there is such a thing as police violence, and not just in the South, and that those practices and behaviors have deadly consequences. And this is largely thanks to cell phone cameras and media coverage. So, you know, it's my belief that all people should have the opportunity to move through the world free from fear of public officials like police, just like white people do.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Magenta. Can everybody hear me okay? I just want to make sure. Okay. Yes, definitely hit the nail on the head there. And I just want to say thank you again to Beth and Tara for hosting this event. But to just add a little bit to that, it's just, you know, the understanding that, you know, we don't live in silos, right? We are all on this big old rock together. And just because, you know, the police are an entity that have existed to serve and protect, you know, predominantly white, wealthier people doesn't mean that this institution works for everybody. It's, you know, understanding even my privilege, right, of being an able-bodied person and recognizing that just because I might be able to reach out and open up a door doesn't mean that everybody else can, right? And so if there are alternative ways to bring access to safety, to bring access to protection, that, you know, won't be at the expense of Black bodies, then we should absolutely explore that. And I'm grateful for the awareness that we are starting to have these conversations more. But I think the point that I would love to drive home the most is that, you know, we should not have to see more Black and brown people murdered and harmed, and, you know, more Black and brown communities destroyed just because we, you know, choose to not try to figure out an alternative. If we can try to figure out an alternative, then, you know, it is our duty as human beings to protect each other and to really explore that and to make that mandatory in our cities. So that, you know, that's why I definitely believe that white folks should try to find an alternative, because just because it works for you doesn't mean it works for everybody.
So I grew up in suburban St. Louis, which thinks it's a Midwest city, but is really in the South. So it's a little bit confused. And I certainly grew up with a lot of those messages, Beth, that you reference, right? That I certainly never thought of the police as deadly. And I think that the question is interesting about why should I have alternatives to calling the police now? I would argue we've needed alternatives to calling the police for forever, right? And now it just happens to be on the much more on the front of more people's conversations. But the lynchings and murders of Black people by police and of brown people by police have been going on forever. You go back to the civil rights movement in the 60s, right? A man was lynched today, right? Often with the assistance of or with police. But I think today, part of what we're seeing is increased militarization of police that we've seen over the last 10, 15, 20 years. And that's an increased problem. We also see where even police, given the historical context that both Magenta and Carrie provided us with, have been there to protect and serve wealthy white people, that what we expect them to do and answer for is so much more than crime, right? I don't know exactly, unfortunately Vinny's not here because he'd tell us better, but a huge percentage of police calls have to do with domestic violence, right? And not a crime going on necessarily, where somebody much more well-suited and well-trained to answer that could be called in. That's one of the many reasons that alternatives are necessary. We see people who are struggling with mental health issues. We see people who are struggling with trauma, and white people in particular's initial response to that is to call the police. We need an alternative to treat people, to treat people who are unhoused, to treat people who are suffering through bouts with whatever trauma or mental illness they're dealing with some sort of humanity that is different from a militarized response.
Thank you all for your responses. I think they lead well into the next question. So to your point, Scott, that you just talked about, there's all these other kinds of issues that someone might see or playing out in a community. And many people's response is, well, I need to call the police. I want to help in some way, right? And so if I don't want to call the police, but I also want to be a good community member or supportive, what do I do instead when there is something wrong?
I'll jump in again. I just to address what Scott had referenced, I don't know the specifics for domestic violence in particular, but we do know that the national statistics say that 95 to 96% of the calls that are made to 911 are actually nonviolent in nature. And so when we think of policing around, if someone's being violently attacked or, there's some type of violence occurring, we're only talking about 4 to 5% of the actual calls that are received. And so that is a minuscule number considering the fact that, as Scott indicated, police are intended to answer all of these types of calls regardless. And so the vast majority of them are not things that they're trained for or that they're specifically designed to address. And so, to the question of, well, if there's something going on, what are our alternatives instead of calling the police? Well, I would say that falls under the category of care not cops, which happens to be the name of the Portland effort to defund the police and redefine public safety. And so what that really refers to is the fact that if you have all of this funding going to police departments, which are usually the biggest part of a city's budget, and yet the biggest part of what they do is really not related to what we have identified police for, then those funds could be actually moved to really investing in the community. So it's like funding the people instead of funding the police. And so that's really what we're talking about. And we're talking about, building teams like there's a project out of Jamaica, New York, that actually has citizens, members of their community that intervene in street violence and have had huge success with that. There are other community-based programs. There's even one here in Denver that deals with youth and youth-related violence and interferes with that chain, that cycle that leads to what they call the school to prison pipeline. And so there are programs that have already been tested and tried that really shift away from this carceral approach, which is people in cages, right, to ways that really focus more on conflict intervention, de-escalation, restorative justice. Using community-based resources, but those resources need funding. There's also programs that get to the root causes of violence in communities, whereas things like food and housing insecurity, where it's physical and mental health, lack of those resources, where it's lack of economic opportunity, lack of support for families. So those types of things, they have been shown to directly relate to the levels of violence in a community, which is why you don't see either high levels of crime or high levels of police presence in suburbs and affluent neighborhoods, right? So those types of things can be addressed, but they have to have the funding. And that's why we're calling for the police force to have those funds be moved over into things that actually invest in the community.
Thanks, Magenta. And definitely want you to add on to that. And as you're doing that, so if I'm sitting here in Park Hill or in Denver and we're waiting for some of those bigger changes, what are, in addition, some things that we could do right now? If I saw something tomorrow, what some suggestions of what I could do?
Well, there's actually, of course, we've talked a lot about the STAR program in Denver, which has been very successful and is just completing a very successful pilot. Didn't have to have one of the over 700 calls escalated to police. The city's been behind it as well as the community. And so we're actually in the current budget negotiations talking about shifting more funds to the STAR program and expanding that program. Of course, that program is, for those who don't know, is a paramedic and a mental health professional that go out and they answer 911 calls that typically would be answered by police. And typically those calls have to do with welfare checks, mental health crises, even like medical crises, usually typically having to deal with unhoused folks. predominantly. And so they have the training, they have the facilities, they have the resources that they can use to help these folks, rather than it having to be police. And they're actually somewhat more efficient because they're spending less time in a call than police typically spend in the same calls. So it's things like that that are giving, you know, us an alternative here in Denver, and we just want to expand that. Now it only happens in the Lollipop District, which is central Denver, and, you know, downtown, and a bit of Broadway. And we want to expand that to the greater metro area. So STAR is like one example of that, but there are some others, and I will definitely put that information in the chat to some of the other alternatives that we have available to us here. One of the references I'm going to put in is called don'tcallthepolice.com, and it's actually don'tcallthepolice.com/Denver that shows the resources that Denver has, and I highly recommend that as something for people to have at the ready, even printed out or whatever, if that's helpful, so that you can have alternate numbers to call. And there's also an alternate number to call STAR. So I'll put all that information in the chat.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Magenta. That's what I was gonna say. Don'tcallthepolice.com for sure. You know, take a screenshot, whatever you got to do to familiarize yourselves with the alternatives that do exist, so that, you know, there can be, the more we use them, the more funding we can hopefully get into those alternatives, so we can expand those programs. And you know, the reality is that, you know, with the STAR program right here in Denver, like Magenta said, not one of the calls needed a backup response by the police. In fact, quite the opposite occurred, right? There were, I want to say, about almost 36 calls that the police actually needed to make to the STAR van. And so what we're seeing is the reality that these services are we definitely need these services fulfilled more than just, you know, the typical law enforcement or the duties of the police as they are right now. And so what I would highly suggest is, as we are familiarizing ourselves with these services, that we are also demanding that our city respond to the needs, right? And make sure that these services are, the amount of service that we're getting, the amount of money going into these services are in proportion with the need, because right now they're not. We realized there was a recent study done, I think it was Pew Research, that said that within a 12-month period, it was like over 90% of officers said that they did not get any de-escalation training whatsoever, right? So what's often happening is that when we do call the police, they are making the situation a hell of a lot worse, right? And I know that that may be the intention of the individuals that are coming to the call all the time, but that's the design of the system, to be honest. We have to recognize the design of the system. We have to recognize that at the core, at the root of the system, it was not designed to serve and protect all people. And so if they are not getting this training, if these alternative resources are not getting the funding that they need, then ultimately, you know, the police have become more harmful than they are good. And so we are in a position right now where we have to educate ourselves. We have to educate each other in the community. And when we talk about things like, you know, community programs, you know, I know that there have been these conversations about like neighborhood watch and things of that nature. Let's remember Ahmaud Arbery. Let's remember Trayvon Martin. Let's remember that these situations, when the training is happening, they don't need to be led by the police. Because if the police are the ones that are, you know, working within an institution that has dehumanized most people, Black, brown, and poor people, then they don't need to be leading the trainings on, you know, on educating community members on how to create alternatives, right? We need to be working together to talk about what are the needs that we all have. What are the ways that we can all acknowledge that these needs can be met, and collectively find ways to make that happen? We can police ourselves. We can work together. We have proven that, right? And we need to invest in ourselves enough to make it that a reality, but also demand that our city invest in us. And so while these budget conversations are happening right now, we need to get involved in that. We need to tell them where these dollars need to be going. We also need to be telling them how the how the current police structures need to change while we are working on divesting some of this funding, and most of this funding, to be honest, from the police force, because we don't need a militarized police force. We can also be, telling our police force or informing what that should look like. I was having a conversation on a recent task force about the fact that I think it was back in the 90s, there was there was an ordinance change that allowed for police officers to serve in districts or to serve in precincts that they do not live in, because police officers couldn't afford to live where they were working, right? And so instead of changing the laws so that you can, live an hour and a half away and then quote unquote serve and protect a community that you have no connection with, we should be demanding that, first of all, any of these service officers are paid appropriately. We should be demanding that that anybody that is in a position to serve and protect reflect the community, come from the community, have a relationship with the community. You should know the people that you are serving. You should be in the neighborhood with the people that you are serving. And if that is not the way that it's currently set up, we collectively need to demand that it change. And so these are ways that, as we, like I said, re-educate ourselves, we can change the system so that it actually does fit the needs that we have recognized and that we are demanding. Yeah, so that's
it. So specifically the question, I don't want to call the police, but I want to be a good community member. We got to remember that while most of us have grown up with the ubiquitous and universal, sorry for the redundancy there, 911, that's a relatively recent occurrence. That when I was growing up, we didn't have 911, and there was a massive PR push and a massive growth of 911 between about, 1973. By the end of 1976, 911 was serving 17% of the population in the United States. In 79, it was 26%. So it wasn't until 87 that 50% of the population was served by 911. So part of the question is, what were we doing back then when that was going on? Because we weren't calling 911, right? It was trying to have conversations. It was trying to figure out what people's needs were, and trying to contact people who could help provide for those needs. And I don't know why we don't move back to that at this point. I think that there's a combination, and Carrie really alludes to this, of a need to figure out practically, what do I do if tomorrow I walk outside and it's under 20 degrees and there's someone near me who is unhoused and is freezing? Who do I call? Well, because if I call 911, right, we know, and we've watched the police and the city engage in raids on these homeless encampments, likely unconstitutional, and we don't need to get into all that, but raids on these encampments. So I wouldn't even consider that, right? And does it make sense for me to invite somebody into my house who may or may not be healthy, right? We're living in COVID times. Maybe that's not the right thing for me to do, but I need to start to think about it and plan for it, is one. Two is, I need to put pressure on my public officials to figure out that if our budgets as moral documents are meeting what we need them to meet. Tonight, the Denver City Council is considering a $25 million contract to Allied Security. We already pay our police force, and we already pay now private security companies, because supposedly our police can't do it, but we can't find that money to continually fund a STAR program that's providing alternatives. Let your voice be heard, right? If you're in Park Hill, there's a good chance your city council person is Chris Herndon. And Chris needs to hear from a lot of us, because Chris needs some help with his backbone from time to time. And he needs to hear that we aren't in favor of that $25 million going to Allied Security. We're in favor of it going to alternatives to police. People need to hear that, and need to hear that message repeatedly, and need to hear that more and more of us believe that and know that that's what's safe, and that if we care about our neighbors, if we care about the people in Denver who are suffering, then that's what we need to do. Then we need to act both on the individual incident level, but also on that broader systemic level.
Thank you, all of you, for your thoughtful answers. And as you're sharing sort of both the individual and the systemic and the city level and all the different pieces, it also strikes me that a piece of this conversation is around interrogating, do I really need to call anyone? Right? So some of the reasons why we think we might need to call the police, taking a moment to think, okay, what really is going on here? You know, why am I uncomfortable, or what am I seeing? Because I know that we've seen multiple situations across the country where the start of what ended in either harm or death or murder of a Black person by police started with a 911 call that didn't need to be made, right? So there's also that like stopping and reflecting piece. And I don't know if anyone wants to respond to that.
Yeah, Beth, I definitely would like to. I think one of the things that, you know, might give us pause is if we really consider policing in the historical context, right? We've come to understand or accept that public safety equals policing. But what it's really manifested in this country is mass criminalization, and that criminalization was not accidental. So one of the things that we need to understand is that the origins of policing in this country are from the slave patrols. Those folks were hired to go and recapture escaped slaves and either return them to their masters or kill them. And so that is actually how the policing system that we have today traces its way back, right? Its history. And then when you look at the interests that policing is represented, not just in this country, but in every country that, you know, especially in Europe, where, you know, this concept was originated, it was to protect the interests of the wealthy. It was to protect property. And you'll notice that even when police were deployed, you know, when the federal forces were deployed and all of that, the calling cry was about destruction of public property, right? It was not about defending people and their safety. It was about defending buildings and property and things that were owned. So, and owned by either government entities or the wealthy. So that's the context of policing. If we really understand the history of it, and if you understand that, you understand that policing that we see today is working exactly as designed. It is not a matter of reform, right? It's not a matter of tweaking it or making it work better. It is actually functioning the way it was designed to work. And so the only way to actually have a different system that actually cares about harm done to human beings on every aspect of this is for it to be transformed. It has to be transformed to a whole nother form. And that's what's really being called for by folks like myself who are abolitionists. We are saying that public safety needs to be redefined and re-understood, right? That by criminalizing everything, by making all of these things a crime, and having the highest rate of incarceration in the world has not made us any safer. We're not safer as a result of that. And so if we really want to reduce the risk of injury, danger, or loss for members of our society, then we have to look at not just how we address those things when they happen, which we can do things like I mentioned before around restorative justice and transformative justice. There are so many other ways to deal with those things, but also the root of them, right? The things I also mentioned about, you know, if people don't have their needs met, this is going to naturally foster crime. And just one last thing we want to remember when we look at the policing system today is the fact of things like the 13th Amendment. The wording of the 13th Amendment literally says that slavery is abolished except for if you are convicted of a crime. So that is license to criminalize people as a way of enslaving them. And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing a disproportionate impact on Black and brown people being incarcerated, and not just being in cages, but also having generation after generation impacted by that incarceration, by the fees and fines that come along with it, by the fact that you really, even if you're in community programs, you're still incarcerated. You know, it's hard to not be recidivist. 2 out of 3 people out of prison end up returning. And largely those things have to do with not being able to function in the greater society, because we deny them jobs, we deny them educational opportunities, we deny them housing. So there's so much in this system that has to be looked at if you want to look at the entire context of what we call public safety.
And can I just add to that a little bit? Real quick, I mean, you know, Magenta, when you said that, you know, basically people are trying to get their needs met, right? And if all, I think what I'm hoping that we all realize at some point in time is that if all of our needs aren't met, then none of us are safe, right? We are inherently unsafe when we don't have access to fresh food, because everybody has to eat. We are all inherently unsafe when we don't have access to fresh air, because we all gotta breathe. If, you know, we don't have access to clean water, then we are not safe. If we don't have access to shelter from the elements, then we are not safe. It's really just getting to the heart of humanity and prioritizing that above everything else. And, you know, being in situations where Black, brown, and poor people have had the least access to these things. That's why, you know, it has become so easy for them to incorporate that slavery and to you know, find new ways to enslave Black, brown, and poor bodies by criminalizing these things that they refuse to give us access to, right? So when we're talking about safety, I'm really hoping that, you know, I'm so glad you brought this up, Magenta. I'm really hoping that we are all understanding that not having the access to the things that allow for us to just survive as human beings makes us unsafe, period. So we have to approach this with a very different understanding of who we are as human beings and what we need as human beings, and prioritize that and make sure there is uninhibited access to that.
Great, thank you. Scott, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Absolutely not. They covered everything I possibly could have said.
Great. Then we'll move to another question, which is that thinking about community conflict, right? So just conflict within the community is often addressed through channels like calling the police or reporting to the city. What is your vision for a different way of addressing community conflict? So thinking on that community level, your neighbor's dog, whatever, right? What are alternatives to addressing that conflict that don't involve sort of escalating or using these systems as you all have been talking?
I think it's important that we think about what community conflict is, and what are the sources of community conflict. And I'm not, you know, a conflict center professional, but it seems to me that if we don't consider what the sources of those community conflict are and where those occur, right? Is this somebody who's upset because somebody else's dog pooped in their yard, or is this somebody who's upset because somebody's not mowing their lawn enough? Is that the kind of community conflict that we're talking about, or are we talking about the kind of community conflict that occurs when people, as Carrie was really talking about, are concerned for their safety or for their child's safety because there are people who don't look like them around? Is the source of that community conflict the fact that that we're being fed constant media messages about what's unsafe. And so we're internalizing these biases that suggest that someone who doesn't look like us, who may or may not, we think, belong in our neighborhood, is that the source of our conflict, or is it conflict because there was a car accident? I mean, that community conflict and that broader community conflict, I think, are really important to consider what the causes of are in that question when we think about what the vision is for a different way of addressing community conflict. I think a lot of that starts with that idea that we've talked about a lot tonight about root causes, right? And we know that even if we eliminate a lot of those root causes, that people would suggest that conflict to some degree is inevitable, right? And Beth, I'm guessing you'd agree with that from a certain perspective, and that the question is how do we deal with that conflict? And I think the most important thing we can learn to do is listen to each other, to truly listen to each other, to not draw lines and to not make assumptions and to not make presumptions, but to really practice, how is this person's lived experience? How do I honor? How do I provide dignity to another human being's lived experience that may be very different from mine? And in all likelihood is. My lens, my perspective is always going to be starting from my lived experience. But how do I get into a headspace? How do I get into a frame where what I'm trying to do in the midst of conflict is to listen for and to honor that other person's or those other people's lived experience, because it is as important as mine is. It is as worthy of dignity as mine is. And I happen to live in a world that honors my lived experience much more than those of my Black, brown, indigenous neighbors. And I know that. That doesn't make mine more important. That doesn't make mine more worthy. And yet, that's where a lot of us walk into this from. And so I think if we can begin to shift our perspectives, that's part of my vision for how we address some of those community conflicts.
Thanks, Scott.
Yeah, I mean, communicate, talk to each other. And for the love of God, social media is not the only way to communicate. Like, we have to, really find the courage to knock on each other's doors. And, if you're living in an apartment complex, just say what's up to your neighbor. Like, try to interact with them. Try to, ask them if they need anything. Like, just build those relationships. I mean, like I said earlier, we are on this big rock together, whether we like it or not. And we are collectively building this world as we are seeing it manifest, whether we like it or not. And so if we want to collectively do something different, then that starts with the collective. It starts with understanding each other. It starts with, just building these bridges together. And just because I don't like you doesn't mean that I don't want you to eat. You know what I'm saying? Just because I may not be in agreement with you all the time doesn't mean that I don't want you to live a dignified life. You know what I'm saying? We have to get beyond ourselves and understand that we are collectively driving ourselves 100 miles per hour into a brick wall, and anything that we can decide to do together to just shift a little bit, to just change that trajectory just a little bit, it might save all of us. And so I'm just challenging. I want to challenge every single one of us. I want to challenge myself to find ways to start to build relationships that we recognize are not there, to expand on the relationships that are there, and to recognize that we are building this thing together. So we have lost communication, and we need to come back to that. That's really all I think we can do to make this a reality.
Thanks, Carrie. We did get a question in the chat that's sort of related to this, and I'll throw it in there into the mix, Magenta, before you speak.
Okay.
How do you handle a situation when your neighbor calls the police over a disagreement? So if you have any ideas with that and want to add on to what you're saying, Magenta, that'd be.
Sure, absolutely. So I guess just to first address the person's question, I would say that, once the police have been called, obviously if you're in Denver, my ideal would be that STAR would actually be the ones that would answer that call. If it were something that was clearly nonviolent and non-urgent, that you would have access to where STAR would be who 911 would send out, because of course it's their discretion, right? And so that's one thing that I would say, but barring that being in place, I look at it as like when we have a car accident, right? Somebody calls the police because that's the procedure that we have in place. But that doesn't mean that situation has to be escalated into, a violent situation. We're still human beings, and and I think this is piling on with what both Scott and Carrie were saying, is that we have to act like human beings, and we have to treat each other like human beings, and be respectful in that. And so if it's within our power to de-escalate the situation, to try to have a conversation and to, bring things down, or if sometimes people just want to be heard, right? If you just let them vent, sometimes that's all it takes. And then, the cop gets there and nothing really needs to be done. So that's ideal. I know it doesn't always work out that way. And so to speak to where I kind of was going before the question is that I don't know about most people. I had the fortune of actually, as part of my master's degree, taking courses on mediation and conflict resolution. I would say that the majority of us have not had any training in that, besides possibly you, Beth. So, it's a gap, right? It's a gap in our understanding, and it's actually been a gap in our priorities as individuals, to understand how to communicate with one another and how to be in these situations where, okay, conflict arises, but we can mediate, we can negotiate, we can have intervention, we can de-escalate. There are tools that have been proven to work in these types of situations. The labor movement, full of that historically, right? Where there's a clear conflict between the two different sides, and yet they find a way to work through it to get to an agreement. Those are the types of skills that we need as individuals, that we need to have taught, that we need to have as part of our community. It can't always be depending on institutions to be the source of that. I would love to have more institutions that are the source of that, more of these transformative and restorative justice programs and all of that. But that can't be the only thing that we rely on. We have to kind of get out of this paternalistic mindset that our government and, public services are what takes care of everything for us. Now, we are human beings, and if we relate to each other as human beings, we can find a way to actually connect and to have these very humane interactions.
Thanks, Magenta. And you mentioned, the hope would be that they would send something like the STAR program. And that brings up a question that did come through the chat that they said, when I asked the city council person how to call the STAR program directly, they said I had to call 911 first. Is there a way to call them directly? I know we put the phone number for STAR, the direct phone number, in the chat. So I just wanted to give you a chance to clarify how STAR works in that regard.
Absolutely, yeah. So yes, you can call STAR directly. There is a number. I wish I could actually say I have it memorized, but I don't. I know the last 4 digits are STAR.
We have it in the chat, actually. We already put
it there. Put it in there with my list as well. Actually, it's 720-913-STAR, which is 7827. So yes, that number directly calls STAR as well as 911. You don't have to call 911. I think part of the reason that they tend to encourage people to call 911 is simply because it's easy for people to remember. But as Scott said, we haven't always had 911. If you put something in your phone, all you have to do is basically click that person and it calls. So I definitely encourage people to have STAR in their phone, especially if you're in the downtown sort of lollipop area. But again, we are very hopeful that in January of 2021, we're going to be able to expand the program to a larger portion of the Denver Metro. And, you know, my hope and prayer is that it's going to expand throughout Colorado and throughout the country. We've had so many people to inquire about STAR, and, you know, even more so, I think, than the Cahoots, because a lot of people didn't know about Cahoots until they heard about STAR. So, yeah, we have an opportunity to take this model nationwide. And yeah, I'm very hopeful that that's what's going to happen.
Thanks, Magenta.
Sure.
Scott, did you have something you want to add?
Yeah, just wanted to add quickly to that thought of the question of what happens if my neighbor calls 911 about a situation, and I think it depends on who you are. For me, part of it is I want to be there to observe. I want to be there with my phone on when the police show up. I can be there. I have the option and the privilege of interrupting the police if there's something going on that doesn't require their presence, or where they are over responding or escalating a situation. If I need to put myself in a situation where I'm interfering with that, I'm willing to do that. I recognize not everyone is, but I have to be willing to do that personally, morally, because I know where it could head. Right? The likelihood that there is going to be the harm that comes to me in that sort of situation is much lower than it is for a Black or brown person. And I know that, and I recognize that. So it doesn't, I don't even think of it as putting myself in harm's way. Right? And to Magenta's point about training and about de-escalation, we are emotional creatures, right? And I was just talking with a friend today about the fact that we respond much more to our fears than we do to our hopes and dreams. Right? There's an anthropological fight or flight response. We don't have the same response to run towards our hopes and dreams. There's not the same pull, and so it's very difficult in a moment where our adrenaline's pumping and where we're highly emotional and where there's conflict going on, to sort of set that aside and think about what's the rational course of action here, as opposed to what my sort of lizard brain is telling me I need to do.
Thanks, Scott. And to that point, and to Magenta's point earlier, I think most people we aren't taught the skills to deal with conflict, right? So conflict is inevitable, as you said, Scott. And we often in society are taught to avoid it, or don't feel like we have the skills to address it. So, and that is one of the goals of the Conflict Center. And part of our mission is to provide people with practical skills for the everyday conflict. So if that's you want some more skills, check us out. Right, like you were teeing me up on that one, right? Okay, so we do have a couple more questions. So given our time left, I'm thinking maybe we try to aim for like 2 minutes per question, and you all can take turns. But the first one is a big question. What's the difference between reformist reforms and non-reformist reforms, and how can we apply that lens to building alternatives to policing and the prison industrial complex?
I mean, I think one of the clearest differences for me is that, to reform something, you think that changes can happen within it, minor adjustments can happen within it, but it can still exist as is. And, like to Magenta's point earlier about the fact that we have to consider the root of the current police system. How did it start? What was the reason that, it was created as an institution. And when we recognize the very harmful reason for why it was created, we recognize that you can't reform that. You can't reform that away. It has to be completely transformed. It has to be taken and turned into something completely different, because the heart of it is a harmful institution. And so to me, that's the clearest difference between the two. And, you know, I think that it's really hard to try to figure out, you know, for some people, abolition is a scary word. For some people, defunding is a scary word, and I get that. But when we recognize the when we recognize the very reason as to why the police exists as they do today, I'm hoping that it would encourage people to understand that it has been more harmful than it has been helpful, and to challenge ourselves to really, you know, take the responsibility and the accountability of allowing for an institution like that to exist for as long as it has, and just choose to do something different. And I know that that's harder than it sounds, but we're going to have to be courageous in doing so. And yeah, that's it.
Thank you. Yeah, go ahead, Scott.
Just real quickly, I'd add that, just based on what Carrie said, that one, we talk about defunding, and that defunding word is scary. The comparison that's made often is we've been defunding education for years. We've been defunding all kinds of essential services for years. And if we were funding those better, then the defunding gets a lot less scary. I think that's number one. I think number two, if we're talking about reforming and not abolishing, and I think a lot of us would move towards abolishing, that there's an issue with the personalization of what happens, right? The response to Black Lives Matter being all lives matter or blue lives matter, right? Because what people hear is only Black Lives Matter. And when people say Black Lives Matter, they're saying we live in a world, and we've grown up in a world, that we know Black lives don't matter, and it's time that they matter. And what happens in that conversation is then it becomes, well, you're attacking this good person I know who's a police officer. And I think we have to depersonalize it and talk about, it's not the person doing the good things in the role. It's the fact that the role exists, and it's the fact that the role has a historical purpose which continues today, even if there are people who we personally know who are good, who are quote unquote doing a good job. And so if we're going to move towards abolishing, we have to acknowledge that it's not about the individual people. It's not an attack on those individuals, and to depersonalize it to some degree.
So moving from the individual to the group or systemic, and continuing to keeping that conversation in the place where we're talking about. Yeah. All right, so this question is more of an individual question, but I think we have the answer already. So the question was, what would be a good course of action for someone who keeps having to contend with a homeless individual choosing to camp in the alley behind their garage, dumping trash and blocking access to the garage? Talking with the person has not been productive and leads to feeling unsafe. My guess is this is probably something that STAR is designed for. Is that correct, Magenta, or anyone else?
Yeah, I mean, yes, there is definitely a component of that, because a lot of the folks that STAR ends up dealing with are unhoused, and they do have a lot of resources that they have access to and that they work with in order to help those folks. But one of the things that we have to understand, again, this is not about an individual situation. And I understand that when you're in it, of course, that's, you know, a concern you have. And I'm not saying that there aren't, like, there are definitely other resources. I definitely point you back towards Don't Call the Police, that website that I mentioned, that has other resources that help the unhoused, and talk to those folks. They are very well versed in how to deal with situations with the unhoused, but a lot of these folks have mental illness issues. They may have, you know, chaotic substance use. So Harm Reduction Action Center is a great resource for that, which I also put in the list that I put in the chat. and so can give you good advice on how to deal with those circumstances. But we have a huge homelessness problem in the city, and so it is going to be on your doorstep in one shape or form or another, right? And then so until we deal with the bigger issues, this is not going to be something that you're just going to be able to wish away. Unfortunately, it's a function of privilege that we even think in those terms, right? And don't think in the terms of, oh my gosh, what can I do to help, right? We think of, this is an inconvenience to me, this is disturbing to me, so therefore I want it to go away, and that's why we call 911. That is not the answer, right? That is only a poor Band-Aid. So I'm going to give an example, right? I have a cake factory. As part of that cake factory, a little poop gets into the cakes, just a little, but that's okay, right? You're still good on my cakes? You still want you want my cake? I'm thinking you don't, right? And so when you talk about reformist reform is saying, well, we'll just put some icing on that cake, or we'll just make it a different flavor or whatever. Poop's still in the cake, right? When we're talking about transforming, right, that's what you want. You want to go in, you want to clean that up, you want to make it completely different so that it actually works and it's actually good, clean cake. And that's what we're saying. When we say transform, that's what we mean. We don't want to slap icing on it. We don't want to just cut it into a different shape.
Thanks, Magenta. I think that is a very clear and powerful metaphor that will stick with folks. I appreciate that.
Sure.
All right, so we've got 1 minute left. So apologies to those folks in the chat whose questions we didn't get to answer. I think some of them got answered, if not directly, indirectly. But I do want to end with what specific actions can I take now to work towards transforming safety in Denver? So if each of you could just share like one specific thing, like they get off of this and they can go do something, what would that be?
Get involved in your local politics, and recognize that we got to put our money where our mouth is. Budget conversations are happening right now. They're going to be voted on by City Council on November 2nd. So I highly suggest that you start, reaching out to your council members and let them know what safety looks like to you. Let them know some of the ideas that we discussed today, if they resonate with you and you think that they can work, and, we can at least just try something new together. But, as we are working on ourselves individually, and interpersonally, we definitely have to address what's going on systemically. And it starts with the budget, fam. It starts with putting our resources where they need to be. So that would be my suggestion.
Thanks, Carrie. Scott, Magenta?
You're here today, and thanks for being here, and thanks for being part of this discussion and listening to us. I think that's outstanding. I think we talked a lot today about de-escalation, about how we deal with conflict. And so what does it look like to take a little bit of time for yourself to find a community course, to find a library-based course, to find a conflict center-based course that would allow you to start to work on some of those skills if you're uncomfortable with them, and start to work on what does it look like for me to be a member of my community, whatever that community is, who's able to have these conversations. I would say that, and I would say commit to, as long as it's around, using other services, putting those other services in your phone, the Harm Reduction Action Center, the Colorado Crisis Services, to commit to using those instead of just knee-jerking and calling 911. I think if you can do those small things, that could make a big difference, of course, in addition to Carrie's suggestion, because that's where I would have gone to.
So I would just leave you with the word aid. And the A stands for attention. Pay attention, right? That's what Scott and Carrie are referring to. Pay attention to what's going on in your government, in your local and state. Number 2, involved. Get involved, right? There's always something that somebody can do. There's so many organizations out there that need your assistance and help in this fight. Pick a particular topic that is important to you. And D is for donate. Support these organizations with your time, with your money, with just like in these situations where they need support in order for this, you know, intention of a future that we can all be happy with can go forward.
Right. Thank you. Great way to end. I love that. And Scott put the acronym in the chat too, so you all can see that. Well, thank you all for your time and your brilliance and sharing this hour with us and the community that's on. Really appreciate it. Tara, do you want to have any final closing words?
On behalf of the Denver Public Library, thank you so much to Beth, Scott, Magenta, and Carrie Joy, and all of you that came. We had over 75 in attendance, and I think we broke a new record. Hopefully we'll be able to make this video available on the library's YouTube channel, and I'll get it to all the panelists right away. The Denver Public Library is very interested in all of the people of Denver voting this year. So if you haven't voted yet, also if you haven't filled out the census, we would really like you to do that. And we'd really like for you to take care of yourself. And that does not mean to just make yourself more productive or try to get back to normal, because what's that? But let's imagine a new normal together and where everyone is cared for. So thank you all, and I look forward to hearing what you think about those resources we shared tonight. So we'll see you at the library sometime. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Scott,
Thank you.
Magenta, Beth, Tara.